the theme of this meeting is about going to scale, scalability, and we're at such an incredible moment where we have an executive branch proposal on the table to expand high-quality early education. So it couldn't be a more important time to be thinking about these issues, as you said, Bob. And I'm going to orient my comments to the first two presentations with apologies to Minnesota and Georgia representatives for their wonderful comments, which I didn't have beforehand. I'm going to talk first about the NCRECE presentation, identifying what I think is a really core issue here, and then talking about systems and scalability. So in our field right now, we have a bifurcation between what Susan Newman has called knowledge-focused professional development and practice-focused professional development. Knowledge-focused being coursework and training that's intending to lead early childhood educators to change in their understanding. And for years, there was an underlying assumption that change in knowledge would automatically lead to change in practice. This has now been very much challenged, and we're seeing coaching and direct feedback on practice as a very important emerging approach. But we really are bifurcating between these. And I think one of the most important things about the presentation that you gave, Jason, and thank you so much to you and your team, is to begin to break down this bifurcation. This study presents very important results that helping teachers identify very specific positive practices is important and can in itself lead to change in practice. So the questions that I see are, can this be introduced into higher education coursework on a regular basis? Can we be using a focus on practice in what has traditionally been knowledge focused? And on the other hand, with our coaching, are we jumping to coaching before we have taught teachers to be able to identify specific positive practices? So I think there are very important two-way implications. On the other hand, this presentation gives us a very difficult challenge because the coordination of these two approaches didn't yield very much in terms of evidence of a greater effect, even though that was the hypothesis. So I want to talk about this just for a moment. In the work that I did with Catherine Tout and Tamara Halley at Child Trends, reviewing the literature on professional development, one of the key features of effective professional development that we saw as promising was tightness of alignment. Of course, you heard this very much in John's presentation as well, but a tightness of alignment. And so what I would like to ask is, would it be possible to focus on a particular set of concepts in language and literacy, get teachers to be able to identify them, and then just working on that concept, get them to send a tape focusing on that? Are we working on too great a distance between the concepts and being able to recognize the practices and then actually enacting them and getting feedback on them? So I think the issue of tightness of alignment is very important, and if I were to suggest a next step, it would be to see about the feasibility of interweaving these more closely, both in our coursework and in our coaching. And feasibility is such a critical issue on this panel. Is it feasible to do a course in which you focus on one module and then get feedback on the practice on that module? Is this feasible, or is it just too expensive? We heard from Georgia, the representative right now, about how we have to take these issues into account. I also want to call attention to the fascinating finding in the NCRECE presentation that there was lack of consistency and effects across sites. And this made me think very much about the book on implementation science that's just about to come out, edited by Tamara Halley and Allison Metz and Ivelisse Martinez-Beck, that says there are these invisible features of our programs that we're not thinking about. We think about our fidelity of intervention measures, but we're not thinking about how our interventions fit into existing systems, how to make them work with existing systems, and what supports we need in our systems. So this was a program that was woven into existing Head Start programs and pre-K programs, but how did the one teacher who got this work with the other teachers? How did the education director or coordinator feel about this intervention? Was he or she brought in? What were the key supports? I think a critical next step in this work is looking at the context that interventions are brought into and making sure that they are ready and that we're not contradicting existing interventions in these sites. So those are the two key things. I think thank you for breaking down assumptions about the bifurcation of knowledge-focused and practice-focused higher education. And I just want to say we're in a room with unbelievable experts on higher education for early childhood. I'm looking at Marcy Whitebook, who has worked on a cohort approach, and the whole issue of readiness of the higher education system for the teachers who are actually going to need it. And at Marilou Hyson, who's worked on multiple papers that say we're not dealing with looking at the quality of higher education. We need a research agenda around higher education, and I would love to invite their responses, especially to thinking about system-wide implementation of integrated practice-focused and knowledge-focused approaches in higher education and what we might want to do in terms of evaluating such approaches. I'm going to turn quickly now to John's paper. John, you are not just urging us to think about integration within 3 separate programs, but then their higher order implication. You are the Uber integrator. And there is also fascinating resonance across the different pieces. So in the piece that has to do with integrated data systems, I also heard an echo of EPIC's need for feedback loops. You don't just want the data. You want to make sure that you use it for the good. And so forth. I see lots of cross-resonance. I'm going to talk about individual challenges with each of the 3 pieces that you discussed, and then also conclude with comments about the systems issues that I think you're presenting. I'm going to refer now to work by Bobby Weber on integrated data systems. You've been thinking about this for a long time, and you've always talked about 2 key issues. One is relationships among the people who own or are in charge of the different data systems, and the other is protecting individual data and security procedures. So as we're thinking about scaling up, you had to do water skiing, John. But what are the pieces that we need to have in place before we urge a state to do an integrated data system in terms of the distributed leadership of those who've traditionally had those data systems? So now I'm crossing the distributed leadership concept to data systems. What are the relationships? What is the trust? And what are the protections that we need in place? I don't think it's enough to say just every state needs data system. What is the readiness of states to have integrated data systems? I'm going to turn now to EPIC, which actually lives the recommendations of the Head Start Secretary's Advisory Committee. Now I'm looking at Peg Birchnell and others who were part of that effort, who said with John that what we need is tighter alignment and feedback loops, that we don't have tight alignment between our curricula, our professional development and assessments. We shouldn't be assessing unless it feeds back into change. Our professional development has to map closely onto our curricula and our assessments. We need tight alignment of all of these. But you are raising the critical issue of fade out in your presentation and continuity across ages. And I understand that if we're going to address fade out, we need stronger effects to begin with. And this has to do with a lot of the work that we're doing in the QDOT project with Luisa Tarolo and Elizabeth and Peg Birchnell. We need stronger doses, and the EPIC program is an example of this. But if we're going to prevent fade out, is it enough to have it in 1 year? When you draw that map of continuity, do you also need to think about what happens in 1st grade and in 2nd grade? Do we need such approaches across the years, or is I'm very worried that we as an early childhood community are being held responsible for what happens afterwards, and that EPIC will increase the dose and the strength of the effects, and other approaches will as well. But is it enough to think about that 1 year, or do we have to think, when you talk about continuity, do we have to take the EPIC step of thinking about what happens in the subsequent grade and what kind of tight alignment and feedback loops we need there? And then 3rd, in terms of distributed leadership, I really had the pleasure of going onto your university's website and learning a lot more about this, and how literature reviews have been saying that principals need to be leaders of leaders, that we need not to disempower our staffs, but to include them in decision-making and leadership and create leadership teams. But to me, the critical question, because I saw fade out as so central to your presentation, the critical question to me for future research is, what can we do to effectively create teaching teams that include early childhood and kindergarten and 1st grade? I think we have enormous challenges in kindergarten, among kindergarten teachers right now, facing a huge range in the skills of the children, in the languages of the children. We're giving some children a boost, and then kindergarten teachers are faced with some children who are doing very well and others who are not. And now, Catherine Magnuson, I'm thinking of your work on catch-up as opposed to fade-out. What do we need to do in our teaching teams to help the kindergarten teachers not just let the kids who've had the boost sit and marinate for a year while they catch everybody up? What do we need in terms of teaching, distributed teaching teams that will help us with the carry-through of our early boosts into subsequent years? And what do we need to study that would create continuity of teaching teams across early childhood into the early grades? I think this is just absolutely critical. So I'm going to conclude just by saying distributed leadership did not bring about effects on child outcomes. It brought about effects in Pennsylvania on school climate, on sense of engagement of teachers. We know that the work environments of teachers are critical in early childhood. We know that this is critical. But if we're going to be thinking about child outcomes as the ultimate goal of our logic model, we need to make sure that something like distributed teaching, distributed leadership actually has effects on child outcomes, as in all the presentations. We need to deliver to the end product. And if you are urging us to take all three pieces of data systems with feedback loops, of an integrated child assessment with curriculum and professional development, and distributed teaching teams, we're going to need to be able to, first of all, cope with the complexity of dealing with three interventions with fidelity, and second of all, test empirically that doing all three is actually going to augment the effects and prevent the fade out, so that we actually deliver in terms of child outcomes. So the most important end product, and the thing you made me think about, is what are the studies that we need to show that you get greater outcomes when you take all three into account, and especially those key transition points between early childhood and kindergarten. Thank you.